I've tried to set this up so it's easy enough to kind of follow along. There's some stuff that I did ahead of time just for demo's sake, but as you're creating it, you can totally use just print statements to make sure the different inputs coming through. But what I set up is like a little, just kind of like mini demo that just has a cube that moves and it shoots other cubes. So like a precursor to a shmup or something like that. Yeah, and I just posted a link, and oh, it looks like we've got 4 people. That's great. So just to get started, I want to try to give like an overview of why Unity has created this new input system, and what the advantages are and what the disadvantages are. So the main problem that Unity is trying to solve is that there's different controller types, there's different button configurations, and they all sort of come out differently. So I've got a couple controller examples on the table. This is a Logitech controller. It has, 2 analog sticks and 4 face buttons, and 2 top buttons and 2 bottom buttons that aren't triggers. So it's a little bit different than, say, like this Xbox controller, which seems the same on the surface, except these aren't buttons, they're actual triggers. So they come through as axes. The other thing is, because there's no standard, all those buttons can kind of end up in different configurations. So if you're mixing and matching controllers on a multiplayer project, or you're creating a game and you don't know what kind of controller the end user is going to have, it creates some frustration where, say you always want the lowest most button, or like the south button to always do one thing and the west button to always do one thing, those buttons will shift around on you in the old input system. So here is kind of like just a little setup that I have where it's using the old input system. I'm calling it player old, and I'll show you sort of what happens in this demo. So I can use my left stick, and I can hit a button and shoot little bullets. It's very, very, very simple. And just so you guys kind of know where this is coming from, I'm going to go over this code first before I start getting into the input system itself. So this is using the old system, and this is my extremely basic code for making a shmup. Let me make that just a little bit bigger while I'm talking about it. So what we have is all the namespaces that Unity brings in automatically. I have a float for the speed. I'm getting the rigid body, and I have a prefab for the bullets that get created. On awake, I do a lookup for the rigid body, and on update, I get a reference to the input horizontal axis, the input vertical axis. I store these floats, and then I set them to a velocity, multiply them by the speed, and that gives me my movement. For creating the bullets, I have an input.get button down, and jump is predefined to be the space bar. So when I hit space, it shoots. When I hit one of the face buttons on the controller, it shoots. And when I do that, it instantiates a bullet. The actual bullets have pretty simple code that's also not really relevant for this demo, but I'll show it to you anyway. The bullets, basically, when they're created, they get an add force on the rigid body that pushes them upward. And then I have this destroy timer that just kills them after 5 seconds, so we don't get a memory leak where bullets build up indefinitely. So these things exist to kind of give you a visual representation of the demo, but you don't have to try to build them yourself. I also created a bit bucket. So, I should see if I updated the bit bucket. Yeah, I think everything's pushed. I also created a bit bucket so that you can, if you want to just download the completed project, and not try to type everything yourself as we go, you're welcome to do that. I put the bit bucket in the title, but I'll post it into the chat here as well. So it's just bitbucket.org/artfail. I only have one public project, and it's the new Unity input system demo. So anyway, here's our old system, and to get a fire, we have to look for a get button down or get button up. And to get movement, we have to get axis horizontal, get axis vertical. And that is set up in the input manager settings. And horizontal, vertical are already set up by default. Fire 1, 2, 3, 4, and jump are already set by default. You can see that it's looking for joystick button 3, or if you're on a keyboard, looking for space. So that's how we've kind of been doing input traditionally. So Unity kind of was looking at how frustrating it is for people, and third-party software like In Control or Rewired started gaining popularity to kind of solve a lot of these problems with joystick mapping. And Unity kind of saw it as a deficiency in their current system, so they decided to start building their own version of this. When they made it a package, and one of the things that I don't like about the way that Unity operates is a lot of times that they'll start deprecating the old stuff before the new stuff is really ready and full featured. So the new input system as a package, it's still technically in preview and it's still missing a lot. But they kind of already consider the old input system legacy. So let's go ahead and get started here. So the first thing we're going to do is add the new input system package in the package manager. So I'm going to go to package manager, and because it's in preview, I need to make sure that I'm showing preview packages so I can actually find it. And I'm going to hit input. And we see right here, input system preview. As of this recording, it's preview number 6 in version 1. I'm going to go ahead and install it. So I think it's supposed to be, oh, what just happened? Well, I've never seen that error before. Okay, well, now it's happy. Now I lost my train of thought because I got a big red error. Oh, so yeah, probably down the road when you see this, it might not be in preview anymore, and you might not have to say show preview packages to get it. When you install it, it says, hey, you're using the old input system, but your project settings are set. Your project settings are set for the old one, but now you got the new one. Do you want to go ahead and update your project settings? And you say OK and just kind of let it do it. And then I'll go ahead and I'll show you like basically what it changed. Okay, so the input system is set up, and if we go to our project settings, player settings, and other, down here where it says active input handling, you could have the old version, the new version, or both. For this demo, I'm going to have both because I sort of wanted to show you like the old way of doing stuff. But if you're not using the old system, you could just have it on the new one, and that's it. So make sure that that's set and you actually have that package in your package manager. So once that's set up, once that package is installed, you'll see that you have this thing, input system package, and here you can create a settings asset. Creating a settings asset isn't actually required, but if you want to start screwing around with things other than the defaults, it makes sense to do it. It kind of gives you sort of like an overarching way to change things like the dead zone and stuff like that. For this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And now I have this input settings asset that I can configure however I want. The other thing that you can do here is add items to the supported devices. This is a little tricky. This is they have a little explanation here because it's a little deceptive the way they word it. Really, the supported devices is everything, and if you add something to here, it works as a filter. So if I say support devices Gamepads, and it's only going to be looking at Gamepads, it's going to stop looking at everything else. So to support everything, you leave it alone and add nothing. Kind of reverses the way you normally think about this. Just because I don't like kind of dangling things hanging out in my in my assets, I'm going to make a folder called settings, and this is where I'm going to put all my new settings and stuff. So my settings are in here, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new input controller map. And I'm also going to put it in settings. So let's hit right click, create, and it's at the very bottom, input actions. And by default, it's called new controls. I feel like I should give it a slightly better name than that. But you can see it's completely empty here right now. I'm going to call it player controllers. Controller. Okay, so I named it player controller, and I'm going to dock it because I'm going to want to screw around with it a lot. So I've got player controller docked right now, and you can see there's this thing called action maps, actions, and properties. So you can create different action maps. And usually the two different things I make are like, I make something for player input and I make something for UI. And then under actions, you would make things like shoot and move. And then properties are sort of like the input itself. So let's just kind of start here with creating some movement. So I'm going to create a new action map. I'm just going to call this players or player. And inside here, it automatically makes a new binding. I'm going to get rid of it, but I'm pretty much going to delete. So this action, I'm going to call this move. And action type here, you can have like a button, a value, or a pass through. I think pass throughs don't. I think they're basically values that don't filter. I could be wrong there. I haven't really used pass through. Pretty much, I'm just using either values or buttons. So for this one, for our input, we're going to use a value here. It's not a button. We're just reading things from a joystick. So I'm going to say value and then control type. There's all these options. I'm going to choose vector 2. So this data that comes through from my controller is going to be a vector 2. So now that that's set up, I can make different types of input for this. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to do add binding and do gamepad. So I'm going to say gamepad left stick. We're all good there. That'll work fine for my Xbox, but my Logitech is actually a generic joystick. So I'm going to add another binding here. So I'm going to say add binding, and then I'm going to say go back here, go to joystick, and go to stick. So I've got that. The other thing that we're going to do here is you can see there's this little asterisk right here. This means this hasn't been saved. And The way that I usually do this is I create it as a class. So over here I'm going to say generate class, apply, and then when I hit save asset here, it updates this class that it generated from all this stuff. So my actual input here, my interaction as the user, is this kind of like three-tiered menu system. But what it actually makes here is this full-on class that's like the result of this. I know some people like to have autosave. This really kind of slows down my computer, so I make changes, and then when I'm happy, I just hit the save button. So you got to remember that, or you can hit autosave, then you don't have to remember it, but at least for me, my computer just starts kind of chunking along when I have autosave on. So right now we have our left stick for regular gamepads and our joystick for anything that comes through as a generic looking joystick. The other thing that I'd really like to add here is input for keyboard. So let's add the mouse arrows. And so if I say plus here, instead of binding, I'm going to say 2D vector composite. And what that does is it lets you put in 4 different key inputs that generate a 2D vector. So I'm going to add that. So you can see it's got up, down, left, right. There's no bindings here. And to get the bindings, I'm going to go listen and hit a key, and nothing works. And this happened before. And I solved it by restarting Unity, and then it started listening. So that's annoying, but let's give it a go. So my live input, I'm going to save this. Let's reopen live input here. And let's see if we can now use the listen functionality. So if I say listen, now it works. Okay, that's a Unity fun gotcha. If the listen isn't working, restart Unity, and then it tends to work. So what did I do? So if I hit the listen button, I can hit a key on the keyboard or on a controller, and it'll show me a list of options here. So I could choose from the up arrow specifically or any key on the keyboard. I just want to use the up arrow, and I'm going to do the same thing for the down arrow. And I'm going to do the same thing for the left arrow. I'm going to just hit listen, hit left, click that. Do the same thing for the right arrow. Listen, hit right. Cool. So now we have our input set up here, and we're going to start getting into code. Code can be a little bit tricky. I'm going to talk about like 2 different ways of doing this. There's one that gives you kind of more access, but it's heavier on the code side. And then there's a version that uses components, less code for you, but less direct access to kind of like what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and save my asset, and I'm going to start a new scene and a new folder called new input. And I'm going to make a copy of my player prefab. What just happened? Move that over. And I'm going to make a copy of my old code so we can kind of just like start editing it. Gonna move that over. Okay, so let's player new. I'm just re-editing the name, and I know I got to change the class. I'll do that in a second. So here's our new scene. I just like black better, so changing the background here. We've got this player prefab. I'm going to take the script off of it and going to dump that in the space. And let's open up player new. So right now this is just a copy of player old. But we're going to make some substantial changes to it, and my IntelliSense has been a little weird lately. Anyway, well, that guy's thinking. We're going to look at how we start getting this set up here. So the first thing we need to do is actually like bring in our controller. So this is the class that we generated. This is over here in settings. So I just called it player controller. So in awake, I'm going to say, actually I need to define it ahead of time. I'm going to say private player controller, and I'm just going to call it controller. And then in awake, I'm going to say controller equals new player controller. Okay, so that's sort of the beginning. We need this to access this class to get pretty much all the data. Oh, there's my IntelliSense starting to kick in. Nice. The other thing that we need to do, another gotcha is do this on awake, not start. If you do it on start, it won't be defined for the enable and disable part of this. So you got to actually create it on awake. I think anything you can put on awake is good. It's good practice to just put things in awake in general if they're not related to other game objects. So you're not trying to run everything on start, because start hits all game objects at the same time. Awake can be spread out a little bit. So anyway, so that's why I have like date component on awake. But anyway, so we're going to do a new controller on awake, and then we essentially have to enable it and disable it. Rather than kind of typing this out, I have like a little cheat sheet over on the side. But here's what it's going to look like. So on enable, we're going to enable the controller. On disable, we're going to disable the controller. So already you can see that we're starting to add a bit more code than we would have in our own system. And that's why I'm going to do like a version of this that doesn't actually have so much extra code in it as well. But this, for me, this is a little bit of my preferred way. So we're kind of starting here. Okay, so to kind of get this input, we can take out this, right? We're not trying to use input, so we can bump this out of here. I'm going to comment this out for now because we don't really have Fire set up yet. So right now, we just basically need to set this velocity, right? So to basically pull values, now that our controller is set up, we basically can say like, okay, on update controller dot, and then we follow how this is actually set up. So I'm going to say controller dot player, and then dot move, right? Let's take a look. Player move, cool. This is kind of like what I'm looking at. And then I want this move value. So I'm going to say read value. And the type of value is a vector2. If you're reading a value that's not a vector2, put whatever value here that value is. This is basically a way for me to convert this data out here, which I already know is in this format, into this format so Unity gets it. And so we're getting this vector2 straight out of here. And I'm just going to replace this thing here, and we get something that looks like this. So now I'm setting the velocity to the vector2 that I'm pulling from the input, and I'm multiplying it by speed. And that is the gist. I see a little error popping up over here. Oh, no, it's gone. All right. Let me test this out. Nothing's super easy the first time. So let's make sure we've got a new input, and our player's got player new script on it. Oh, we need to add our bullet prefab back in. Okay, so we have our new script. We don't have any errors yet. Let's go ahead and try to run this. Cool. So I'm using my generic Logitech controller. I can move around. Now I'm using my Xbox controller. I can move around. Now I'm going to hit keys on the keyboard, and I can move around. So cool. Our new input system is working. So let's go ahead and add shooting backend. So we go to the input system. So I have move, right? I'm going to add a new action, and this action is going to be a button. And I'm going to call this fire. And for this binding, I'm going to do the joystick trigger. So this is the primary button on the joystick. I'm going to add another one for the Gamepads. So let's go to Gamepads. And here we have some pretty nice options. This is a simple game, so I'm going to make both the west and south button. So everything's in a cross. They're not calling it X, A, Y, B on because like everything's different, right? Some controllers are 1, 2, 3, 4. PlayStation is like square, X, circle, triangle. So it's determined by orientation. So we have north, south, east, west. So I'm going to have both west and south. Whoops. D-pad. Here we go. South. I'm going to have both west and south be fire buttons. But this kind of shows us another like limitation to the system where because the generic joysticks all have different configurations, Unity essentially just gets the first button it finds, and that's what you got. And if you want to use multiple buttons with a generic joystick that doesn't adhere to like the new Gamepad standard, then you kind of have to write your own class for it, which sucks because I want to make games that people can use even if they're using older DualShock controllers like this Logitech. And I'm going to go into how you can add controllers that are more specific, but the problem with it is you sort of need that controller to be able to listen to it, to add it to it. But let's get the code working, and I'll bring in some other controllers, and we'll play around with it. So I'm going to go ahead and save my asset. And so now I have fire, and to have an event take place when fire is called, I actually need to add some more code up here. So this might look a little different than what you're used to, but we're essentially adding an event listener, and we're putting it into a function, and the function is nameless, so it's just kind of an anonymous function, and we're adding a context, and I'm just going to type it out, but yeah, you'll see it. It might look a little weird to you. So we start out with controller, and then I want to access the players, and I want to access fire. So now I need to add an event for when that's performed. So there's a property called performed. And equals, let's see, it's okay. And so I'm going to add a listener to that, and I'm going to, in between, I'm going to reference the context, so the context CTX, just an abbreviation. And we're essentially throwing this into a function that doesn't have a name. So in here, I'm going to say, call another function called onFire. And just so you kind of can see what this context thing is, I'm going to print the context so you can kind of see that. Okay, my onFire doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to go ahead and make it over here. So and it's a void. And what we're pretty much just doing is doing what we were doing before, only we don't have to have an if statement running on update all the time. So this is a little bit smarter. It's just going to listen to whether this action is performed or not. And, oh, I need a semicolon here because this is really just all one line. And, yeah, call that and instantiate it. And let's take a little test run. So you can see my little characters making bullets. Things are pretty cool. And then over in the console, you can see everything getting spit out of the context here every time I hit this fire button. And it might be kind of hard for you guys to read, but what it's saying is action equals player, fire, Logitech dual action, which is the name of this controller, trigger, and then X input controller Windows, button West. So it's giving you pretty much everything that's like happening, performed time. It's just kind of an info dump. So it's kind of nice to use that to sort of see what's going on. But I'm going to take that out for now because print statements take a lot of resources. But I just kind of wanted you to see like what that whole context thing is. And I think you can get rid of the context as well if you want. So yeah, let's pull this guy out completely. And right now with this code, we've got a player running in the new input system. And it's pretty great. Pew, 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 pew. All right, let's see. Oh, let's see what people are saying in the chat. Thanks for doing this. You're welcome. Looks like a scriptable object. It's playing with that idea. Flan says thanks for the subscribe. Thanks, Flan. Hey, Drew, how are you doing? Lots of wood ups.
Oh, I definitely need to do this. Cool. Sunday Unity. It's the brand classic. Shout outs to Yushin and Fawn and Drew. And Babycastles. Hey, John, can you say more about what you see on the main advantages of learning this new system? Sure. And then how do you differentiate between get button down, get button up style, or is that different properties such as performed? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'll do the first question first. So the main advantage here is if you're using modern controllers, so a modern Xbox controller, a Logitech controller that adheres to the new Gamepad spec, a PlayStation controller, something like that. You don't have to worry about your buttons moving around or your axes moving around. So the only thing that was ever consistent with these controllers was the left axes. The button position was never consistent. The right stick was never consistent. And so it became tricky. You had to write a lot of code to figure out like what kind of controller was being used and sort of configure it on the fly. With this, as long as it's one of the newer gamepads that uses this sort of standard setup, then your buttons won't move around, your axes won't move around. Like someone could play your game with a PlayStation controller with an Xbox controller and be totally fine. So that's the pro. The con is older controllers essentially have gotten like left by the wayside in a way. The other con is multiplayer is a little bit more tricky, and I'll be getting into that in a little bit. But the thing about doing it this way is this is the way Unity's moving, and it'll probably jettison the old input system at a certain point. I'm really hopeful that this becomes more robust. On the forums, a lot of the guys working on it be like, oh, we're whatever feature anybody's asked about, they're like, we're going to get that in Unity 2020. So hopefully it's growing. But I can talk about kind of how you can work with getting more generic controllers in the meantime. Yeah, that's why I want to switch mainly. Okay, so things like get button up, get button down, those are actually, this is another thing that is kind of cool here, is you would usually have to, there's certain types of events that you could subscribe with through the input system, like up and down, but then things like presses, holds, rapid fire, you would sort of end up writing yourself. With this, you have these options here. So not only can you just listen to it, but you could listen to a hold, a multi-tap, a press, a slow tap, that kind of thing. So you just kind of add this interaction on here, and so it'll be looking for that in the binding, basically. The other thing is processors, and these will do things like, well, you can kind of see this list here, but you can like normalize the output before it's coming. There's also things like, I think they also count as interactions. I'll look it up, but there's another thing that you can kind of build in where it's like this action comes through as a different thing if you're holding one button and moving another, like I don't know, like hold right trigger and move the control stick right could be basically filtered as a separate action, as just doing it separately. So there's a lot of stuff like this that we would normally have to write ourselves that's now kind of baked into the interactions and the processors part of the system here. So yeah, so if you were doing like say if you wanted something to be able to tell if something was held and then released, you would essentially use the held interactions, and then you wouldn't have to write a Boolean that's checking button up and button down and then check that Boolean. Okay, so let's talk about working with different types of joysticks. So in the old days, I wrote a actual thing to sort of like look at what joystick input was coming in through Unity. Now they actually have a analysis window for that. So you can say input debugger under analysis,
and you can see all your devices. So so let's say I've got a Logitech one plugged in. If I double click on that, I can see everything getting pressed and like what it actually is reading as. So like this right stick is coming through as RSD. I can see what it actually calls button 10, button 11, etc. as I mash on this. I could do the same thing with this Xbox controller that I have plugged in. Yeah, this Xbox guy. So, so this is really useful when you're trying to figure out. At least for me, I like to make dual stick games. The right stick, if I'm not using something that meets the Gamepads spec, is all over the place as what those actual like axes are. So using this kind of tells me what's going on, and then listening kind of helps me map, at least if I have those controllers available. So we have a situation where we have west and south, but we only have one button for our generic controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another binding here, and I'm going to go listen and hit what essentially is the west on here. And so I've got this trigger for dual shock. Cool. And then I'm going to add another one for the south button. So I'm going to listen, hit 2, button 2. Cool. So the fact that I already have trigger coming through on this joystick probably means I don't need both of these. I don't think it hurts to have them both, but sometimes you might want to check. Sometimes it might make 2 bullets if they're both firing. Sometimes it won't, depending on how Unity is feeling. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in. I've got this aerial controller. Babycastles has a couple of these too. They're pretty good. They've got a fan built in, but they also don't adhere to the normal gamepad spec. So if I want this one, they're basically the same buttons. Oh, and this guy has a completely different button layout than the other generic. Its button 3 is west and its button 1 is south. So I'm going to add this button, this guy as well. So I'm going to hit plus here, add binding, listen. I'm going to hit button 3, which is west on this one. So I get the airflow popping up. Let's add another one for south, add binding, listen, hit south. And I've got trigger airflow. So you can see how trigger is the south button on here and the west button on this other one. So already you can kind of see how it's frustrating using the old system, and using the new system, I can go ahead and then map that over. So I'm going to keep all of these up and make sure I save my asset. And let's hit play. And I should be able to move this guy around with, let's see, so I can shoot with both. This is great. Do both of these. So you're probably noticing that, like, I pick up this controller, I'm moving this thing around. I pick up this controller, I'm moving this thing around. So I've got 3 gamepads and a keyboard plugged in, and they're all doing the same thing. So what if you want to do multiplayer? Well, this is something that the people at Unity, I think they kind of were mostly done developing when they were like, oh shit, because multiplayer came out kind of late in the development process and people were asking about it for a long time. And the way you do multiplayer is you actually, rather than using the class system here, you actually use a component system. So I'm going to continue this demo with a component system for the new input system, and then transition that into a multiplayer version. Can you change bindings at runtime? I believe so. I know on one of the forums there's a pretty long thread about changing bindings at runtime, and I don't think the length of the thread makes me think it's probably not easy, but I think most of those were marked like solved. So yeah, I think there's a way to do it. Unity has, if you download, I shouldn't say download, I should just say install. If you're in the package manager and you take a look at the input system, there's a bunch of demos here that you can import into your project and experiment with them. And one is basically doing a remap, where you can like tell your players what button to press for like action and cancel or whatever. So that works, but I noticed that the way they did it, they were only using standard gamepads. They weren't using generic joysticks, at least in their demo of how to put it together. But yeah, these are pretty good resources, especially since there's not a ton of good documentation online. I figured most of this out by like opening things up and like picking through them, basically. Getting a little bit of a clue from one tutorial, a little bit of clue from another tutorial, and then kind of smashing it together and then like looking at how the examples actually run. I would love to have more from Unity as far as explaining this, especially stuff like making your own classes. Like there's just a paragraph that's like, yeah, build your own class, it's easy. And it's like, I wouldn't know where to put this class, how to classify it. So yeah, Unity can always use some more documentation there. But yeah, I believe to kind of like I believe like rebinding is cool. That's essentially solved, and there's probably a wall you hit with the level of complication you're doing. But if it's more face value remapping, like what most games have, hit the button you want to be fire, hit the button you want to be map, or something like that. Yeah, that should be pretty doable, and you can follow the example. Okay, so let's do a version of this guy that's a little bit less code, but uses components, gives us a little bit less access to the raw data, but makes our lives a little easier in some ways. All right, rock and roll. So I'm going to kind of just start by duplicating this scene. Oh, I should probably make a folder for this. So I'm going to call this multiplayer because this is what it will become. But it's not going to start out multiplayer. All right, so I got my scene. Drop that into multiplayer. Copy my script. Drop that into multiplayer. And I'm going to copy my prefab and drop that into multiplayer. And why is my phone blowing up? Okay, so let's go in here. Okay. Renaming stuff. I'll just call this player. And I'll call this multiplayer. Multiplayer new. How about that? All right, so the first thing for multiplayer new is just renaming it so I don't have conflicts. And I'm going to, on my player prefab, I'm going to remove player new and add multiplayer new. Cool. So this version, we're essentially going to gut a lot of the stuff to start with. So I'm now no longer using this as a class. So I'm going to pull that out. That means I don't need to check if fire is performed. I don't need to enable and disable it. I'm pretty much like down to this now. Let me. Cool. Okay, so this is all really stripped down. We're going to add an extra component on here called player input. So what this component does is it will talk to your player controller script that you made and kind of do a lot of that overhead for you. So if we go back on here, so it's looking for an input action set. So I'm going to get the player controller. And that's pretty much all I need to really worry about. So it's grabbing player as a default map, but I could make another map and change it in this drop-down menu. The UI input, I'll get to that later. Camera, the reason it's asking for a camera is some games, like say first-person games, the camera is tied to the player. So it wants access to that, and you'll see why like later on. When we do multiplayer, basically if the camera is tied to the player, it's got to do a split screen out of it. And then behavior, I'm going to leave this on the default. This is just send messages, which means that they will just essentially get picked up here. So so the way that send messages work is they're essentially an on event for each of these. So I named this fire. So on fire is going to work out of the box. But to get movement, I need to do an on move. I'm going to comment out this update for now. And we're going to go ahead and do on move. Opening up my little Cliff's Notes here. Okay. So void on move. And it's essentially just using on move because I named the thing move. If you name it something else, you got to say on something else. So it's literally just looking at whatever it's called here. I think if I made this a lowercase m in move, this would still stay capital, just following normal conventions. At least that's been my experience. I don't know how Unity kind of rectifies it on the back end, but just to keep things chill, I've been naming all these capitals because that's how Unity was naming them in their demos. Okay, so I have this on move event, and there's some data coming in. And that data is an input value type. And once I bring it in, I've got to actually translate it into something I'm going to use, which is the vector2. So I'm going to say input. Oh, I totally forgot one thing. In this thing, the way we're doing it now, we got to say using input system. Whereas the other one, we didn't have to do that. Cool. So we have to use the input system namespace, and we have to use it specifically for our input value here. So input value is part of that namespace. So this is coming through as a type input value. We know that it's a vector2, but to be able to kind of turn it into something that Unity gets as a vector2, we use a function called get that, to me, the syntax is pretty much just like a get component, but it's just a regular get. So to get it, I'm going to say v.get vector2. So what this will do is take this input value and get the vector2 out of it, and I'm going to maybe I'll just show you the weirdness and then the solution first. So we're getting this, and so normally you would just say, oh, why can't I just set my velocity to equal this vector2, maybe times speed. Should be fine, right? Well, I'll show you the problem. Let's Let's see. Am I in the right? Let me get in the right scene. Oh. This seems to be working, and it's not supposed to be working. Okay, why? If it works now, I wonder if it's a update Unity made. The world might have just gotten simpler in front of my eyes. Huh. Well, I'll be darned. Okay. I guess you can just do that. So I'll explain what problem I was trying to solve, and then, but apparently it solved itself now. So I'm going to add the bullet back in, and so now we have the component version of this guy. Yeah, cool. Okay. So the way that it was working literally like 3 weeks ago is this onMove function would only get called when an event took place. So let's say I hit the keys. Well, let me try it with arrow keys really quick, because that was using control. Huh? No. All right. So you hit the key, and it would move just like a little bit. Or you hit the controller. If you held the controller still, you wouldn't move. So even if you were all the way to the right, if it was still, you wouldn't move, because it was only coming through as an event. So the solution was basically you make a variable that runs an update, and that variable gets updated from this. And if you're looking at if you downloaded the GitHub repository of this, I have that extra movement variable set up in that. But looks like onMove pulls continuously now, which used to be not the thing, but it is what we want. It saves us from doing extra work. So I'm happy about that. If you guys are working from the repo, you can totally delete that extra variable. It still works fine, but that's cool. So yeah, basically this is calling continuously, and like when was I first working with this? I think probably like 3 versions of Unity ago. I'm on 3.9, so at least in 3.7 it would only trigger when you pressed it, kind of like how this on fire only triggers when you press it. So this doesn't do continuous bullets if I hold it down. It just does 1. So, oh, that's interesting. It does 1 on down and 1 on up. All right. So we have a down event and an up event both firing that I didn't notice when I was smashing it. So maybe it just knows now, okay, if you're sending in a vector 2 value rather than what's essentially a simple trigger to pull continuously and not just on the actual event that is pressed. All right, so that makes things a little bit easier for us. So if you look at this code right now, right, this is a lot simpler than the version that we did earlier where it was a class. If you're just getting started, I think it makes sense to do it this way, especially if you don't really need to care exactly which button called on fire, what kind of controller was being used, or what, and you don't mind using extra Unity components that hide some of the extra code and just kind of tuck it away like a black box. then you're good here. Really, the only thing to remember is you got to add the input system, and then make sure your on functions are just named exactly like you named your actions up here, and that problem is solved. So I'm going to transition this to multiplayer. If you guys are all good with this stuff. So multiplayer is actually not too tricky. It just requires you to set things up in the way that Unity wants. So if you, I'll say like a tricky thing is, what if you want 2 players on the same keyboard? That's not really the way Unity wants. There's ways to solve that, but that's a little bit of an uphill battle, whereas what Unity is expecting is a bunch of people with gamepads just trying to join a game. So the way that Unity handles multiplayer with the new input system is easy, but also very very structured. So I'll walk you through it. So the way you do it is you create a player manager. This is just an empty game object. And you make sure that your player itself is a prefab. And on your player manager, you add component player input manager. And this player input manager has an option for join behavior. I'm going to say when a button is pressed, so that means I press a button on the controller, a player joins, and then it looks for the player prefab. This player prefab needs to have the player input component on it, or it won't work. So you already kind of have to set it up for the player input way to do multiplayer. If you're doing the class way right now, you can't really do multiplayer. Unity says maybe they'll get to it, but that's just not the way it is right now. So as long as you have your players as prefabs and they have the player input class on them, you can just set up a player manager, add the player input manager component to it, select your join behavior, drag in your prefab, and then you can also, I think this says players joined by default. Yeah, players joined by default, that's what I want. You can limit the player numbers if you want. For this demo, I'm not. And then split screen, if that's checked, it's going to expect a camera associated with your player prefab, and that's why that other component has that camera section in it. We're all sharing the same screen, so I'm not going to enable split screen, and I don't have cameras associated with my other players. So the result, if we did everything right, is you start out with nothing, but you hit the action button on your controller when you pick it up, and it creates a player. You pick up another player, you hit the action button on that, it creates another one, and now these guys are like 2 players, and then, oh, I've got this third controller that's plugged in. I can hit that and rock and roll. And something just fell over. Oh, I got a error doing something. Variable bullet oh, I forgot to throw the bullet in my prefab. I just threw it in the one on the scene. All right. So let's do that again, hopefully with no errors. So I hit my action button. I got this guy joined. Hit my action button. This guy's joined. Hit my action button. This guy's joined. Cool. And now on keyboard, I have spaces. Oh, I didn't add space to shooting, but yeah, I should add space to shooting. Let's fix that right now. Fire. Let's add one more button, and listen to space. Cool. Save asset. So now we've got this dude, this dude, this dude, and we got multiplayer working. So the main thing is having the code set up like this, and then just making sure you have a player manager that's the prefabs associated with it. Cool. I don't see any new questions on that. If you guys have any questions on the multiplayer side, you can ask now. The next thing that I'm going to go over is making a menu, because the menus also rely on the old event system. This isn't too hard, but I basically found a trick to make it even easier. Yeah, so all right. I guess without further ado, let's talk about menus. And let's see, I'm gonna bring over one I made. Oops, shoot. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to build a menu here, and then I'm going to bring in a menu I built already. The menu part doesn't matter. It's more about the event system with the menu. So here's our basic scene. I'm going to bring in a canvas that I made. So here's the canvas. There's no event system yet. It's just 3 buttons. They're on a panel, button 1, button 2, button 3. So I'm going to create an event system now. UI event system. All right. So if you have an event system and you have the new input system set up, Unity is going to automatically say, hey, you're using the old thing. You want to just use the new thing, and give you a little button to press. So you can press that button, but I think what it does by default leaves a little bit to be desired. So we're going to modify it a little bit. But so here's the default that Unity gives us when we just click the button. We can use our mouse. Oh, I need to, one other thing, with the input system, with event systems, if you want to use them with Gamepads, you always need to have a default item or first selected. So I'm going to drag button 1 into first selected here. So now basically when I hit play, the first thing is going to be highlighted. And I'm using the arrow keys, and I can hit enter to select. So by default, Unity can use a new input system and have enter be select, have the arrow keys work, have up and down on the controller work to move things around, and you also get your mouse working. So it's like 99% there. The only thing that I don't like about just this default setup, and you can see it right here, is that it doesn't really take into account these other joysticks, the ones that I'm like working with anyway. So what I usually end up doing is basically making my own UI with that slight modification added to it. Because Unity's is pretty good, I usually actually just start with looking at theirs. So if I click on their default input map, I can actually double click it and bring it up. This is their default player and their default UI. So I'm going to basically steal their default UI by just dragging it into mine. So now I got my UI going. Nice. And what I want to do is where it says submit button any. Like it has the joystick up, which is cool. It has a gamepad up, which is cool. And it has keyboard, but like their submit buttons don't really, they're not looking for like the joystick triggers. So this is like this the barest bone thing you can do, but you can add binding, and then go to joystick and then trigger. And now it's going to listen to the joystick triggers on the menu as well as the gamepad ones. So I'm going to say save asset. If you want your submit button to be not just a single button, but any of them, then you would also like add those here. Like if you wanted it to be like west and south, like I did for firing, you can add all these here under submit. And I'm just playing with my own input maps, not Unity's, so I can be comfortable adding stuff, deleting stuff all I want, and not screwing with Unity's default. The main thing that I just need to do after all that said and done is if I go to the event system here, it's referencing this Unity's action asset. I want it to reference mine. So I'm going to go to get out of packages, go back to my own stuff, and drag mine in there. So here we go, replaced, and everything's cool. The other thing I sometimes change is if I need to add more joysticks and stuff, then I can easily add more joysticks to the UI here too, if there's just like special ones that behave kind of weird. So the result of all of that is if I have a player using a weird arrow gamepad, they can hit their trigger button and select items as well. Whereas Unity's default leaves it out because it's weird and annoying. So I've added it and I've updated it. Cool.